From the allegations about the Labour politician Greville Janner, detailed claims about the Liberal MP Cyril Smith, and rumours of a cover-up about a sex ring involving Conservative politicians, stories of abuse in past political life have been dominating the headlines. This is an issue that's hung over the last Parliament and is likely to impact on the next. Earlier this year, the government announced that a judge from New Zealand, Justice Lowell Goddard, will chair the independent inquiry into child sex abuse to carry out an exhaustive and critical inquiry into these and other claims. But their very nature, with the passage of time and lack of corroborating evidence, means that the process, both for those who claim to have suffered terrible abuse and for their alleged attackers, can seem inconclusive. Today, you'll hear the story of David, who says he was abused by powerful businessmen, lawyers, senior military figures and former Conservative politicians, many of whom are now dead. Over the next few days, our reporter Becky Milligan will examine David's story. She'll explain how difficult it can be to get to the truth of what happened 40 years ago. I should warn you that because of the adult nature of the subject, you may find parts of her report distressing.
I just don't know. I mean, I just feel the story needs to be told. You know, it does need to be told, even to put the record straight.
This is the story of what David says happened to him a long time ago, back in 1975, when he was 20 years old.
And I want you to sit forward a little bit towards me, if that's right, right up to the edge, because...
Yeah.
You just heard us meeting for the first time at his home in Northern Ireland a couple of months ago. We'd talked on the phone before then, but I'd gone to visit him to record an interview. We're not using his real name, but it is him speaking.
What are we going to call you?
Let's call me David. Is
David,
that okay?
yeah.
David's story is about historical sex abuse, allegedly committed by high-profile people. It's shocking and disturbing to hear. We've heard similar accounts in the news, and it involves former Conservative politicians and influential men in the business, legal and military worlds, many of whom are now dead. Allegations of this nature aren't confined to one political party in particular. There have been claims against the Labour peer Greville Janner, which his family strongly denied, and against the former Liberal MP Cyril Smith, who's now dead. I have to say alleged, because we use the word when allegations haven't been tested in court, and without that, it's impossible to know for sure where the truth lies. Back to David. He's now 60 years old, married with a family and working. Last year he read an article in a national newspaper about how boys were lured into child sex abuse in London. He says it prompted him to recall events from 40 years ago of alleged rape, sex parties, drugs, drink, appalling child abuse, and those who were involved.
This was something that I had buried for almost 40 years.
Had you not thought about it over all those years?
Well, more recently, I mean, there were sex scandals appearing in the Catholic Church. That sort of was stirring things in the back of my head. Then there were stories about celebrities involved in child abuse and so on. And then I started reading stuff about political involvement in this. And this article really blew the doors wide open, opened the vault, so to speak, and let the demons out. So later on that night, I actually gave the newspaper to my wife, and she read it and said, well, why are you showing me this? And at that stage, I just broke down uncontrollably and told her, you know, I was involved in this.
And that's the first time your wife had heard about it?
That was the first time, yes. It was talk about throwing a hand grenade into a marriage. Told her everything that had happened, and she was obviously stunned and shocked.
David seemed credible to me, but with such serious allegations like this, you can't just take them at face value. Since that first meeting, we've been checking out his story as much as we can. We've spoken to former and current police officers, psychologists and politicians who were around at the time. We have a thick file of cuttings, a copy of a diary and photos. More on those later. But the bottom line is that we're starting from scratch. Corroborating his story, in other words finding indisputable evidence to back it up, is a difficult one. It may be impossible to find, we may never know the truth, and the consequences for victims like David and those who are accused wrongly can be devastating. After all, it happened 40 years ago, and he was in London for just 3 months. Can one newspaper article trigger all these memories? And how certain can we be of them? We aren't the only ones trying to find the evidence. David, too, has been doing his own research.
You've been looking for evidence, haven't you, of that it actually happened, and that you can show...
I've tried to sort of, see if I can gather evidence that I can actually prove that I was in the places that I said I was, where I worked, and so on.
So this is where you have your
This
study.
is a sort of a study dining room.
Yeah.
I find it's quite poignant for me. It's a 45 single, and you can see it's called Make Me Smile, Come Up and See Me, Steve Harley and Cockney Rebel. This entered the charts almost at the same week that I entered London, 1975. It seemed to be playing all the time. If I was going to a restaurant or having a sandwich, it seemed to be on the air all the time. And this whole thing just has a special resonance with me about Make Me Smile, because that's what everyone seemed to want me to do at the time.
Come up and see me, make me smile. I'll do what you want, running wild.
In 1975, we were just coming out of recession. Unemployment was high, inflation had rocketed, we had the European referendum, and Labour's Harold Wilson was Prime Minister.
The issues in the common market are going to affect this country.
Margaret Thatcher had become the first woman to lead the Conservative Party.
It is like a dream, really. Wouldn't you think so? I almost wept when they told me. I did weep.
I spent most of the day with David when I went to see him for the first time in March. He told me everything he could remember, and I asked him questions to try and make sense of what he was telling me. Over the next 4 days, we'll play the interview and also tell you what questions we've been asking and how we tried to stand it up. He arrived in London on the 24th of February 1975 to start work in a bookshop. And the reason he went to London, he says, was because he was desperate to escape the Troubles. After only a couple of days, he says he lost £20 to con artists, and feeling stupid and pretty hungry, he wandered around Piccadilly Circus hoping to win it back in the amusement arcades. He says that a man approached him, introduced himself as Keith, and offered to take him to a pub to meet another man who could lend him some money. It was in the pub that he met a man called Charles Hornby. After a drink, Charles and Keith took David out for supper. David says Keith wasn't a public or political figure, but Charles Hornby he describes as an exceptionally well-dressed man. We found newspaper cuttings from September 1975 about a court case in which Charles Hornby, a well-connected old Etonian, was convicted of several offences, including committing acts of gross indecency. David picks up the story after Charles Hornby had invited him back to his flat along with Keith. To warn you, some of this interview is upsetting and of an adult nature.
They said, look, why don't you come back? I live in Knightsbridge. Go there, have a few drinks, have one for the road. We will order a taxi. I'll give you the £20 loan and we'll sort it out there. So, of course, the alarm bells were ringing and I was feeling a bit worried. To be honest, there was a part of me also that said, this could be a great opportunity. I'm alone in London. I've met two people, one of whom seems to be quite influential, very well-bred, very cultured, and maybe it would do no harm to sort of make friends. We went to a place called Ennismore Gardens, and again then we had more drinks and conversations about lots of other things. And I was really starting to feel, a little bit drowsy and knew myself that it was time to go. And I kept sort of reaching for my coat and trying to go out, but then they would generate conversation around something else. I had never been truly drunk, but I knew what it was like to be sort of a bit tipsy. This was a completely different experience. It was like a nausea, just a weird sensation. So I said to them, look, I need to go here. I need to leave. I'm not feeling well. I got up and I was walking down a hallway, and Charles Hornby was behind me, and I thought he was going to see me out of the door. But suddenly I was sort of dragged and turned into a bedroom, and before I knew it, the two of them were sort of attacking me, ripping the trousers off me and so on, and I was flung over onto my belly, and Keith, he threw himself across my back, and I was raped. Charles Hornby raped me.
Do you actually remember it, or were you too...
I can remember. I mean, it was almost as if I was watching this happen to someone else. It was almost like a detached experience. I mean, you were aware of what was happening, but it was like it couldn't be happening to me. This is just not happening. And it was just appalling, that's all I can say. During one stage, when I was being raped, I remember Charge Harmony saying, "Is he okay? Is he still breathing?" And Keith, I remember his head moved very close to my mouth, and he said, "I think the little bastard's enjoying it," and he bit me on the shoulder. Oh, and that was, excruciating, so I screamed. And at that stage, I just felt completely broken. After that, I just collapsed, emotionally. I didn't care what they did. I sort of said, they can do whatever they want now. I'm going to die. There's a motivation, there's a reason for this. They're killing me. So it can be now, it can be later. But it was just like a totally giving up. That was the end. And I remember feeling, it was ironic. They have survived so many years in the Troubles, surviving shootings and bombings, only to be killed in London, totally randomly and anonymously. I came from a sort of a secluded Catholic upbringing. The idea that something like this would happen was just off the scale. It was just something that was horrific and shocking. And so in any event, I passed out, and I just felt totally broken and devastated and humiliated.
What did you do at that point?
I was still groggy. I was in pain. I was aching from head to foot all over. So he then went out and made breakfast and was really all very matter-of-fact, as if nothing had happened. He said, "I have some very important people who would just love to meet you." And I said, "You've got the wrong end of the stick. I'm not like that. This has been a total misunderstanding. This is not going to happen." And then he said that when I had been unconscious, they had taken sort of compromising photographs with me and Keith, and he warned that these could be sent home to my family if it didn't do what it was told.
Oh, what did that make you
Well, I
feel
just
at
felt
that point?
sick to the stomach. He was saying, "How would your mother, a good Catholic woman, feel receiving a letter and opening these up to see what your son was doing in London? It would break her heart." I didn't know what to think. I was totally shocked. I just felt out of my depth.
Were you scared, do you think?
I felt fear, absolutely. I felt fear, terror even. Just a sense of being completely trapped and not knowing what's happening. How did I get into this? And the other thing I felt, of course, was guilt. Had I been sending out the wrong signals? Is it my fault that this happened? Did I give the impression that I was looking for something?
What happened after that?
I was sort of thinking, well, hopefully now this is the end of the matter. But the next day, they appeared in the bookshop, and they came up to me and said, "There's a party this weekend. You'll be getting the opportunity to meet your elders and your betters. You have great potential. You're going to earn a lot of money," and so on. Then he made another threat. Unfortunately, 2 days after I had started work, there was a young policeman in London who had been shot dead by the IRA. And he said, "A young Irishman comes to London. 2 days later, there's a policeman shot dead." He said, "I could click my fingers and you could be questioned about this by lunchtime." And I said, "But sure, I was in the shop that day." And he said, "Well, I'm not saying you pulled the trigger, but you could have been over here helping and assisting and gathering intelligence, nice quiet sleeper working in a bookshop." So he said, "Either you will be at this party at the weekend or you will be in a police cell getting a confession kicked out of you."
I'm going to introduce you now to former Detective Chief Inspector Dave Marshall. You'll be hearing from him over the next few days. He was with the Met for over 30 years and was head of the paedophile unit. Until recently, he was on the panel of the Historical Institutional Abuse Inquiry in Northern Ireland and has listened to many victims' stories. I played him parts of David's interview and asked him what he made of it.
Without talking about the specific case, but the scenario and the events that he talks about actually bear a remarkable semblance to inquiry I was involved on in the 1980s in the West End of London, which focused on a group of paedophiles who were operating in Leicester Square in an area called the Meat Rack in Piccadilly Circus outside the Wimpy Bar, where young lads who perhaps run away from home, who had come to London looking for a better life, they'd be befriended by this group of paedophiles and taken perhaps for a meal. They may be taken back to their house, allowed to stay there overnight, again given food to eat, and then over a period of time the kind of grooming process would go on, where they would be given pornographic images to look at, and then it would progress to abuse. They may be given alcohol to drink. And then they find themselves in this scenario, and then having been abused, and if it's photographed, they're then in this kind of catch-22 situation, is that if they go, what's going to happen to the images, and threats may have been made that if they go, and people think, oh, why don't people come out? But it's not as easy as that. And even if they do and they tell people, will they be believed? It's and what will their family think? It's all those kind of issues you have to think about.
And from your experience, you've interviewed and talked to so many victims of this kind of abuse. How do you judge whether they're telling the truth?
Well, the starting premise is always that they would be believed. Everything's taken at face value until proved otherwise, then you have a systematic approach of actually looking at every bit of the evidence that unfolds and the information you're given to check it out and see where it leads. We call it a search for the truth. And you have to accept the reality is that you won't necessarily always get all the pieces, but you want as many as you can. With victims, it's very hard to think of a case where a victim has deliberately lied about having been abused. There may be cases where they've been mistaken and got things slightly wrong, or someone else has told them something and they've added what someone else has said to their account.
There are similarities between David's account and Dave Marshall's operation, but there are differences too. The boys he's talking about were groomed gradually. David, who's 20, was drawn in pretty quickly in one evening. And David became involved with high-profile abusers. The abusers involved in Dave's operation were not influential. There are those who say that these stories are made up or are half-truths, that the victims have some kind of false memory syndrome. We did find references to some of the people David told us about on the internet and in newspaper articles from the time. But while that bolsters his story, it may also raise a question. Could his account be a conflation of his own memories and details from his research? But David is adamant that isn't the case. Tomorrow we'll hear the next part of David's story, the allegations of parties with influential politicians where he was paid for sex and that younger boys were involved.
Becky Milligan. Now, yesterday we heard part of the shocking testimony of a man who says he was the victim of historical sex abuse 40 years ago. From the allegations about the Labour politician Greville Janner, detailed claims about the Liberal MP Cyril Smith, and rumours of a cover-up about a sex ring involving Conservative politicians, stories of abuse have been dominating the headlines. In February, the government announced that Justice Lowell Goddard will chair the independent inquiry into child sex abuse to carry out an exhaustive and critical inquiry into these and other claims. But their very nature, with the passage of time and lack of corroborating evidence, means that the process, both for those who claim to have suffered abuse and for their alleged attackers, can seem inconclusive. Our reporter Becky Milligan is examining how difficult it can be to get to the truth of what happened 40 years ago. Today we'll bring you the second part of David's story, and you'll hear about the parties he attended with military figures and politicians, and the abuse of children that he witnessed. I should warn you that because of the adult nature of the subject, you may find parts of her report distressing.
We heard yesterday from David, not his real name, and his testimony about his 3-month stay in London in 1975 when he was 20 years old, how he was allegedly raped.
I was sort of dragged and turned into a bedroom, and before I knew it, the two of them were sort of attacking me.
He says he was threatened and coerced after they'd taken compromising photographs of him to have paid sex with influential men. Last year, after reading an article in a national newspaper about historic child sex abuse, he told his wife about his past. How did your wife respond? How was she
Well,
shocked?
at the beginning she was completely devastated, obviously, completely shocked, and it's been taking a long time to come to terms with it. But, I mean, we are very resilient, and there's times that she actually throws a bit of humour into this as well, would make the odd throwaway comment that would actually make you laugh about it in some ways. But there's other days she's very depressed about the whole thing as well and is fearful of the future.
Historical sex abuse is a story of our time and crosses party political boundaries. Recently, there have been allegations against Labour's Lord Janner, whose family have strongly denied those claims, and the Liberal MP Cyril Smith, who's now dead. David's allegations involve Conservative politicians and people in the business, legal and military worlds. Could an article trigger all these memories, and could they be so lucid? We found similar stories elsewhere, and to put it bluntly, how do we know he isn't making it up? I put these difficult questions to David later on. We also asked ourselves if we should broadcast the names of the politicians he says he had sexual contact with. We wrote to their surviving relatives, but in the end, after numerous editorial meetings, and it had little to do with libel nor whether we believed David or not, it came down to applying the same rules we apply to any story, that we should have two sources, and for the moment, in most of the cases, we just have David's testimony. Today, we continue with David's story about how he was allegedly taken to parties with influential men by a Lloyd's underwriter called Charles Hornby and another man called Keith, who wasn't a public or political figure. To warn you, some details in this interview are distressing and of an adult nature.
I was taken to, it seemed like an apartment somewhere, and it was either near Westminster or Whitehall.
What did it look like? Do you remember?
The room, it just looked like a large room, maybe had about 4 large windows. There was actually large French doors that interconnected into another room, and these were open. They were celebrating the fact that Margaret Thatcher had been elected leader of the Conservative Party on the 11th of February. I was led into this large room, and there was maybe 20, 25 people there. And
how many MPs were there, or politicians? Or
there were certainly 4 or 5 politicians that I knew, and I was introduced to them. I mean, there wasn't any secrecy about it. It was all very open, and it was formal introductions. But I was then left there. Charles and Keith actually left, and I just felt completely abandoned. Now, I have to say that there were other younger people there as well. There would have been boys from maybe about 15 up to my age, maybe 5, 6 or 7 of them.
And what were these other boys like?
Well, they looked a bit rough, to be honest. They weren't particularly well dressed. They looked quite casual. Some of them were wearing jeans, denim jackets and T-shirts and so on. They just seemed, I suppose, rough and ready.
But did it feel strange having those boys there and these politicians? Well,
the difference was the younger people seemed to be entering into the spirit of things. They were actually there to party, and I seen were passing around various drugs and tablets. But there were a couple of tables, and there was a whole array of drinks. Champagne, wine, beers, and there was a large jug of punch, which I sort of tasted. And
were you told what was going to be expected of you at this party? Nothing at all.
Not.
You were told nothing about it. No information.
Nothing about the party at all. But I had a fair idea that it wasn't going to end pleasantly for me. So I started then drinking down, glasses of punch, because it was the easiest thing to consume. But I have to convey this. It was a real party, boisterous atmosphere. There was laughter and joking. There was a lot of banter going on between people.
Do you remember what they were saying?
Well, some of them were talking about the resurgence of the Conservative Party. They were talking about the election of Thatcher, and they were basically saying that they were going to take back the country from Labour, and that there was going to be, in some ways, a revolution, that they were going to make the country great again. But having said that, some of the people who were there were actually joking about Thatcher and making some very negative comments about her. Some of them were saying, I fought in the war, I did this, I did that, and now we have a bloody woman in charge of the party. So there was a lot of banter and a lot of boisterous activity going on. The double doors were closed at one stage then, and the curtains were drawn over it, and then some of the boys started to become quite intimate with some of the older men, kissing, performing oral sex. It was just like a scene from hell for me. One of the politicians started performing oral sex on me, and then another much older politician was encouraged to do the same thing. Then I was made to kneel down in front of them and perform oral sex on them. And at that stage, I was just totally humiliated. So from that really it started. I was drawn into this web where I would have been taken to various parties. I would have been meeting individuals for sex, and just was totally trapped. And that really began my descent into drinking, taking drugs, and it was just a nightmare.
One question we had, at a time when the age of consent for homosexual acts was 21, is, does this seem plausible? Would politicians really behave in this way with people they barely know? At a party with businessmen and civil servants there too, would they risk their entire careers, risk public humiliation? Any rumours or speculation or gossip of this kind could destroy a career in moments, a career they'd probably been cultivating over a number of years. Did you ever have experience of going to Dolphin Square, where people have said there were such parties that you're talking about?
I had attended one very small party. I mean, I was picked up on one evening, and the guy that had left me at a location said to the driver, take him to the Dolphin, and I assumed I was being taken to a pub, that I would then be transferred somewhere else. But it turned out that we were taken to it was a big complex, a big block of flats.
Do you remember it well, what it looked like?
I can remember that it was just an enormous building, an enormous red brick building, and being taken in. It was quite a small apartment, maybe one, maybe two bedrooms. There were a couple of elderly military people there, and there was one young guy from the military who would have been my age, 20, and then there was a rent boy, so there was three of us. And we were made to sit on a settee and perform oral sex on each other. This was being filmed at the time, and then we had to have sex with the other clients who were there.
There's been a great deal of speculation in newspapers and on the internet about Dolphin Square being the location for this kind of abuse. Could David be mixing up his recollections and his research? But it's important to note that unlike other victims who claim to have been abused there, David is clear that no politicians were at the Dolphin Square party that he was taken to. And there's another question. David says they were filmed performing sex acts on each other. Would they really have done that? While cinefilm was popular at the time, this was before the age of digital videos and the selfie. And would those who paid him to attend the party really want to film it?
There would have been photographs taken, but I mean, I've been doing a lot of writing and research about this, and I've seen a series of photographs and seen that a young man on the left-hand side of one of these photographs was me. So it was rather disconcerting to see yourself from 40 years ago performing sex, and that this is available on the internet. And I've given these photographs to the Met as well. They have them, yeah.
And that was in Dolphin Square, was it?
Yes, that was in Dolphin Square.
Are you certain?
When I look at the photographs and see the other two guys on the settee beside me, I am associating that with Dolphin Square.
At this point, I ask David if he can show me the photos. He takes me through to his study, where he's attempting to find evidence to corroborate his story. It means searching through his own possessions and online.
This is me. This would have been maybe a year or 18 months before I went to London, so these were just taken at the time.
Yeah.
And then that would have been shortly before I went to London, those two. And then within weeks we sort of progress.
It's all right.
To this.
They're quite explicit photos,
Yeah,
aren't they?
shocking. I mean, even looking at this one, I mean, I know looking at that I'm quite spaced and out of it. You know, just have a faraway look. So there was, drink and drugs involved here. So, this is the guy that I was telling you was a member of the military. And the other guy over on the other side was a rent boy. So, that wasn't within weeks of arriving.
Yeah. It takes a few moments for David to recover. It may appear odd to search the internet for explicit photos of yourself, and I asked Dave Marshall, the former head of the Met Paedophile Unit, about it. They are explicit and very upsetting photographs for him, and as far as we can tell, it probably is him. We can't be certain. We can't be certain. But, I
mean, what I find is that victims want to be believed, and that's one of the key things. They just want to be believed. And people say, well, where's the proof? So they go looking for the proof. Well, here's evidence of it. And perpetrators do record their abuse. That is one of the advantages in any case, is that search for the evidence, for those jigsaw puzzle pieces that paedophiles do keep documents, recordings of their abuse, and you're able then to use that to corroborate the victim's account. But it's, again, very resource-intensive, time-consuming process, looking for that needle in the haystack.
We're now coming to the most disturbing part of David's testimony about the sexual abuse of young children.
There were 3 occasions when I saw younger boys. There was a house party in Essex, and when I was being taken upstairs and led into one of the bedrooms, a man appeared down the corridor and he was leading a 12-year-old boy there. And, until the day I die, I will never forget the expression on that young man's face. And I tried to look reassuringly at him in some ways, to try and give him something that resembled a smile. But I just saw the expression of fear and terror as he was led past me into a bedroom, and I was just pushed forward in their room and felt totally helpless.
Did you see him again?
No, I never saw him after that. There was another occasion I was being transported to a party, and there was, again, a young boy. He would have been in his, maybe, again, between 10 and 12, 13. He was made to perform oral sex on a car that I was being transported in. I was dropped off, and then he was taken somewhere else. And then there was one further occasion when I was taken to an apartment in Notting Hill, and there were 2 brothers, aged 8 and 10, who were being sexually tortured. And I tried to intervene and was beaten unconscious.
What was happening to them? You can't talk about it.
Can't really talk about it. I mean, it was just appalling sexual abuse. Unbelievable sexual abuse.
And you tried to intervene. What did you do?
Well, this evening started off where I was taken to a restaurant and was told that I would be going to see the best show in London that night. And we were taken there, and it was, very hushed, quiet, large room. A settee had been put against a wall, and there were a group of men sitting around and standing around having drinks. And these 2 boys, I was told they were brothers, aged 8 and 10, were brought out, and they had little bathrobes on, and they were obviously drugged. And one of the men went over and got the 2 boys to perform sex acts on each other, and then it progressed into a much more serious sexual assault. And I, at that stage, just sprang out of the chair and called them all sick bastards and tried to intervene. But at that stage, I just got, a kick in the back and fell to my knees and a few slaps across the face. My nose was bleeding. And then it just turned into a frenzy. I was being sexually attacked. And 2 groups of men descended like vultures on these 2 boys.
It's really very shocking what you're describing. Well, it sounds like a kind of hell.
Well, it is, and I never imagined in a million years I would ever actually sit and talk about this.
Really?
Absolutely. It was buried so deeply.
Here we decided to include the names of 2 men David makes allegations against because they're known offenders.
There are very few of them that would have been involved with what you might call young children, under the age of 15.
Yes.
But there were some of them. Peter Wrighton and Peter Hayman, they were directly, I've seen them abuse young children. The rest of them would have been involved with rent boys from about 15 up to, my age, 20.
Peter Wrighton, who died in 2007, was a social work expert and a member of the Paedophile Information Exchange, a group which tried to decriminalise sex between children and adults. He was convicted of importing child abuse images in 1992. In 1981, Sir Peter Hayman, a former diplomat, was named in Parliament after police investigated him for sending and receiving pornographic material through the Royal Mail. He was also a member of the Paedophile Information Exchange and was later fined after being found guilty of an act of gross indecency with a man. He died in 1992. I played that part of the interview to Dave Marshall, the former Detective Chief Inspector with the Met, who has over 30 years' experience, much of it investigating child sexual abuse. Does that ring true to you as well? I mean, is that something that you've ever come across? I mean, is that typical of what happened?
The scenario of a group of men coming together and younger boys being brought into their company and then sexually abused is very believable, and I've come across such scenarios, so that's entirely believable.
They're only, he says, 8 and 10.
Well, I can believe that.
It's very shocking to hear. It's quite hard for us to take in that kind of abuse, and so we kind of want to just push it away and turn off the radio, or just not hear it, not listen.
You think it's bad to listen to it. What's it like when it's actually happening to you, when you are that young child being abused? So if it is tough, it's a lot tougher for the victims.
And Dave had another question. Why didn't David call the police? That's something I'd already asked him. When you had seen that abuse of very young boys, did you not feel you should go to the police? And why didn't you go to the police?
Yeah. I mean, at that time, I was absolutely terrified. I just felt completely trapped, and that they had a complete hold over me. They had made threats about me being framed for the murder of a policeman. They talked about that it would be easy for them to implicate me in that. They talked about photographs that had been taken of me that would be sent to my family. They had talked about, threatening actual harm to members of my family. So I just felt completely trapped and helpless, totally helpless.
Do you think they're accurate, the stories then, that there was some kind of paedophile ring? Or was it just a group of these politicians and fairly influential people who were involved? It wasn't sort of an organised thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think, to be honest, there needed to be some type of organisation behind this. There were 2 or 3 different organisations that the same individuals were associated with. I met people like Peter Heyman, Peter Wrighton, and some other individuals who were then in the process of setting up what they were calling the Paedophile Information Exchange. Now, some of the individuals there were involved in an organisation called the National Association for Freedom. So even in that sense, from an organisational level, there was networking. But I mean, there must have been lots of other people that knew about it. I mean, even setting aside the people who were directly involved in the abuse, there were lots of other people who must have known, the Mr. Fixers, if you like, the people who would have made bookings, the people who drove cars. One of the things that occurs to me, because I would have visited hotels in London, the Savoy, the Dorchester, the Carlton Club, the Guards Club, and when I arrived at these places, doors mysteriously opened and visitors' books mysteriously closed, and I almost would have glided through to the bar or 2 bedrooms. So that just doesn't happen by its own. There needs to be something behind it, some type of organisation.
Did part of you think, wow, here am I associating with people who seem to be so smart and know so many people?
That's a good question. There was another dimension to this, of course. I mean, I was mixing in with some very, very important people. And there was actually a part of me that, I actually did admire these people. I would have thought, well, wow, why couldn't I have had a father that would have been such a high achiever and achieved so much and were fabulously wealthy? So I was exposed to all this wealth, and I was getting, I would have been being given £200 or £300 a week, which was a fortune in those days. But the ironic thing is, I never had an opportunity to spend the money. I just felt used like a product. And I was just passed around London on almost an industrial scale for 8 weeks. And in some ways, I got through it because I drank so much at night and took tablets that you didn't care anymore. You just got through it. And it was almost like you were playing a role. When I walked into some of these champagne receptions and art galleries and was introduced to these people, and I would have been allocated a companion for the night, it was almost like you were acting in a film, like a movie role.
On tomorrow's programme, David's story continues. He leaves London. We speak to the former Director of Public Prosecutions, Lord MacDonald, and the Chief Executive of the NSPCC, Peter Wanless, who had the task of sifting through Home Office documents attempting to find out whether there had been some kind of cover-up. And I put some difficult questions to David himself.
Becky Milligan, and if you missed Becky's first report yesterday, you can listen to it on the World at One website. And if you've been affected by any of the issues raised in her report, there's information on the website about support groups who may be able to help you. David's story, the testimony of a man who says he was the victim of historical sex abuse 40 years ago. It's a subject which we've reported often on this programme, allegations that some influential men in public life were complicit in sex abuse in the 1970s and 80s. In February, the government announced the judge from New Zealand, Justice Lowell Goddard, will chair the independent inquiry into child sex abuse. It's a hugely complex task to find evidence to corroborate the victim's story, since they happened so long ago. And the people who say they've suffered appalling abuse enter into a process which can sometimes yield few answers. Our reporter Becky Milligan is examining one case to see how difficult it can be to get to the truth. Today we hear her final report, which is disturbing and of an adult nature.
You know, I can't lock it away. I can't unforget it. It's here now and I have to deal with it.
David, not his real name, has been telling us about his 3 months in London in 1975 when he was 20 years old. He came to work in a bookshop and escaped the Troubles. He says he witnessed appalling child sexual abuse.
I tried to look reassuringly at him in some ways, to try and give him something that resembled a smile, but I just saw the expression of fear and terror as he was led past me into a bedroom.
And he says that he was raped and coerced after compromising photographs were taken of him into being paid to have sex with powerful men in politics, business, the legal and military worlds.
And I was just passed around London on almost an industrial scale for 8 weeks. I would have visited hotels in London, and when I arrived at these places, doors mysteriously opened and I almost would have glided through to the bar or to bedrooms.
Victims' claims about historical sexual abuse cross the political spectrum. Recently we've heard allegations against Labour's Lord Janner, which his family have strongly denied, and the Liberal MP Cyril Smith, who is now dead. We've been trying to corroborate David's story, checking the details he's told us of events, people and places, but it may never be possible to find indisputable evidence to back up what he says happened to him 40 years ago. We've spoken to former and current police officers, psychologists and to politicians who were around in the mid-70s. After 3 or so months in London, at the beginning of May in 1975, David says he became very ill.
My health was so bad that I really thought I was dying. My back was in agony. Towards the end of April, I could barely walk. I was shuffling. I was spitting up blood and phlegm and just an unbelievable back pain. And eventually I fell into the front hall of one of the people that I would have been associated with and just said, I'm dying. You're going to have to let me go. And I think he really panicked then because he was afraid I might die in the company of one of his clients. So he gave me, £50 and said, go home. And, the crazy thing is, he said, come back to me. We'll go back to Ireland, get better, and come back, and we'll go and have a nice holiday. One of his friends owned an 18th century villa near Venice. We'll go there for a few weeks, and it'll be all wonderful.
David didn't return. At home he slowly recovered. He got married, had children and worked, and for years put his memories of London behind him. But last summer, after reading a newspaper article about historical child sex abuse, the memories resurfaced. Or as David says, it let the demons out. He then went to the police. What did they ask you? What are they doing about your particular story?
OK, well, I have to, first of all, congratulate the Met because the 2 officers, 2 detective constables that were dealing with me were completely professional. Having said that, the interviews were quite brutal. Just trying to get the information out of me, and they test the information and so on.
Did they drive around London with you so you could identify the places?
Yes, after the 2 days of the interviews, they drove me around the various locations in London where I was trying to identify some of the locations. I have given them hours and hours of videotaped evidence, got into the most explicit detail. They then spent a long time questioning me about this, and I understand that they spent maybe 9 or 10 weeks after that actually following up every lead. Now, the problem is a lot of the people involved are now dead. There's a few of them still alive, but I would say most of them are dead. So, and they have kept in touch with me. and they have informed me generally about how the investigation is going. But the conclusion is that in terms of my story, there's no other leads. They can't take it anywhere else. They can't take it further, unfortunately. Reassuringly, some of the names I have given them have been mentioned by other people who subsequently came forward.
One of the detective constables from Operation Fairbank confirmed to me over the phone and in an email that they had interviewed David. They also met his wife. But when I asked the police to tell me if they thought he was a credible witness, they wouldn't give me any more information. We tried a number of ways and asked a few times, but they just gave us this statement. It is not appropriate for the Metropolitan Police Service to offer comment or guidance when requested on witness testimony or evidence as investigations continue. Part of the problem with many of these types of cases is that the majority of allegations are made against people who are dead. The police attempt to investigate them, but there is a lack of hard evidence, with none of the DNA, mobile phone records or credit card transactions of current investigations. And although the police may lend a sympathetic ear to victims, in the end there is no conclusion to the case. It is simply left in the air. On top of that, since the libel laws do not apply to people who are dead, the families of those accused can't defend their relatives' reputation. The victims and the families are left in a kind of limbo land, or perhaps a better word is purgatory. David is still looking for evidence to back up his story.
You've got files and files here. You've been looking at them so that you can absolutely be certain of the names that you put together with pictures.
I mean, I want to know that when I'm talking about some people here, this is who they were. But
He's shown me a business card from the bookshop where he worked. A book called The Romance of a Bookshop, he says was given to him by one of the influential men he met, which was signed and dated April 1975. And shocking, explicit photos of him taken at the time, which he found online. After he'd spoken to the police, he was searching in his loft and stumbled across a box of diaries, including a section of one from 1975, in which he had written down notes about restaurants, events, people he met, some prominent individuals and some I'd never heard of, and even the weather. On my first visit, I saw it.
And this is the diary itself. And
it's the remains of what was a 1975 diary, and you can see that I've just put entries in from where I started working.
Yes.
And then some of the key events here, for example, got robbed of £20, calling myself a stupid bastard, naming these two R for rape.
Did you put that in afterwards? Because it's in red.
No, I did this at the time for all these, for anything to do with a sort of a sexual encounter.
He gave me a photocopy of the diary. My editor and I went about corroborating as many of the details in it as we could, and we've both questioned him at length about it. David said he hadn't even remembered some of the names and events until he'd read the diary, and found some of the details of the sexual acts he performed quite shocking. There are a few names mentioned in the diary that can be found elsewhere, but some of those he writes about have never previously been linked to historical sex abuse. Does this add credibility to his story or raise questions? Or could the diary have been written later or added to? David is unwavering. The diary, he says, was written at the time. Dave Marshall was in the Met for over 30 years, a detective chief inspector and former head of the paedophile unit. Up until a few weeks ago, he was on the panel of the Historical Institutional Abuse Inquiry in Northern Ireland and listened to hundreds of victims tell their story. And I knew that he'd dealt with this kind of evidence before. I'm just going to show you this. It's just a copy. I mean, and you have dealt with a diary in some of the cases. I mean, is it genuine?
I suppose it's a question that you have to ask. But the big question is, why would someone do that? What's their kind of motivation?
To write it sort of now and pretend
it was written earlier. And then people say, well, they want compensation. They want this. But I've had very few victims who their focus is compensation.
Well, I can tell you, he doesn't want compensation. He simply wants to put, in his words, the record straight.
And there was a period of time where diaries were very popular and people would record them. I think you look at it and it'll have a kind of ring of credibility about it, but it's that kind of painstaking of corroborating what you can looking at the language that's used.
Before my second visit to see David, this time with my editor, I found out that he and his wife had burnt the diary.
And that may present problems if it appears in a criminal case, is that the original, which the actual binding of it and everything else has been destroyed, and you've got a photocopy of the original. Well, that's the next best evidence, but people, rightly or wrongly, will question, well, why did you destroy it? And if their focus isn't on a criminal investigation, it's just on, well, this is just part of my life, this will be symbolic for me and help me by burning this, that in a way helps me deal with it, well, that's their decision.
I never seen this document as something that's an important piece of evidence that would be presented in a big court case. I saw it as an emotional, passionate document that was written by someone. It had nothing to do with the law. It had nothing to do with compensation or money or a good story. This was a tortured, troubled young man who was capturing these events as they happened.
He also felt that if he burnt the original but kept the high-res photocopies of it, it could never be altered or added to, but the document could be preserved. He's now annotated a copy of the diary and estimates that he had sexual contact with over 25 men during his 3-month period in London. He explained to me how hard that was for his wife to come to terms with, and he saw its destruction as a part of the healing process. Do you think it helped you and your wife as well, the fact that your wife was able to see it being
absolutely
destroyed?
yes, no,
for you
yeah,
as a
definitely
couple?
I mean, I felt it was something unclean to have in the house. It was something, I mean, what was in it? It was bad, it was terrible. Some of the stuff that was recorded, I just didn't want that particular document in the house anymore. It was as if, here's this thing jumping through time, let's deal with it, and it's gone, let's get on with our life.
You don't regret burning it, do you?
Given now that some people are saying that it had a historical significance and that it could have a bearing on any legal process, I have some regrets around that. But at the end of the day, it's nobody else's business. It's my choice.
On that visit, David was very open and spent 5 hours answering all the difficult questions we threw at him as we pored over the copy of his diary. I watched him at several points unable to speak because he was so upset by what he was reading. Here is the final part of David's interview. It's such a long time ago, and you talk with such clarity.
Yeah.
And you remember such details which you'd forgotten for a long time. And some people might wonder, how can you remember so clearly when it was 40 years ago?
Yeah. I mean, it's. I think when you go through something so traumatic and see some of the things that I've seen, it is seared into your brain. You can't unforget it. I mean, in some ways, I have successfully buried it. After I was interviewed by the Met, I went through many, many weeks of counselling, and it was during that where I was encouraged to talk about it that all of a sudden I found, various memories and instances and names recurring as I was actually forced to relive it. And it's about putting it in perspective. One part of me says, what I was through was a terrible experience. It involved some senior people, but at the same time, it was only a few weeks, 40 years ago. And I try and say, well, it hasn't defined who I am. I've had a successful career. I have, grown up children. I've had a good life. And that has enabled me to sort of keep this locked away. But I mean, to be perfectly honest, there's times I break down and have moments of emotional collapse. But I don't weep for myself. I weep for the children that I saw. And I wonder, what happened to them? Where did their story go? What became of them? Where are they now? What age are they?
What do you think about those people that did that to you now?
I would like the person that I was 20 years ago, I would like that young man to be able to meet those people and ask them questions from his perspective rather than mine.
Do you wish you'd had more courage, or what do you say to your 20-year-old self?
Well, I mean, it's funny you should mention that, because when I actually write about these experiences or talk about them, I sort of project it back onto this young man. It's almost as if I'm not talking about myself. And I suppose what I need to do is try and capture him and break him out of that and bring him forward and release him from that past that was his.
Are you beginning to, do you think?
I think so, yeah. I think so, step by step. Yeah.
But are you still feeling angry with those people?
I don't feel anger anymore. Anger is just too strong. It's too heavy a burden to carry through life. Being angry doesn't change anything. It won't change the past. You know, in many ways I just feel sorry for them. You know, they had everything. They had money, they had wealth, they had position, they had power. But at the end of the day, they had nothing.
If someone looks on the internet, there's quite a lot of information about this.
Yeah.
They can piece together a story, and there would be people, some people, who might say, you're making it up, you've just read it on the internet. You know, that's where it comes from.
Yeah.
Why should we believe you?
Sure. Well, I mean, I don't think you can make up the fact that I actually left here in February 1975, got a job where I got the job. So there's all those elements are completely factual. People will always choose to believe what they want to believe. I mean, I'm 60 years old. I hope to retire in a few years' time. Why on earth would I bring this turmoil and torment into my life and into my family? I've gone through hell and back dealing with this and coming to terms with it. So I have no motive for doing it. I have no incentive. I haven't and will not seek compensation for what happened. You know, what happened, happened.
I went to see the chief executive of the NSPCC, Peter Wanless, who spent many hours sifting through paperwork at the Home Office, investigating if there had been a cover-up of child sex abuse. He didn't find that evidence.
One of the reflections I have on the many files that I waded through in and around the Home Office was this sort of pervasive sense of difference in priorities at that time. So in the 70s, if there was a suggestion that someone might have committed a crime against a child, the first thought is, well, what impact would that have on the reputation of the organisation? Question one. Is there a kind of national security implication to this? Question two. And today, I would like to think, if someone makes an allegation and someone makes a counter-allegation, there is at least some interest in, is there a child here who could be a victim of a crime, and are there other children at risk?
Lord MacDonald, a former director of public prosecutions, has recently spoken about the decision of the current DPP not to prosecute the Labour peer, Greville Janner, over allegations of child sex abuse. I asked him to reflect on the past as well.
The primary thing that we make of it is that we dealt with this sort of issue very badly in the past, and now we're paying the price. Of course, the victims are paying a much bigger price than the rest of us, but we're paying the price, I think, for a carelessness about people's rights in the past, about a carelessness in terms of the way we looked after vulnerable young people in care. I think institutions from local authorities to the armed forces to the BBC have not performed as well in the past as they should have done. I hope one of the results of the inquiry will be that we'll all perform better in the future. And of course the police and prosecutors didn't perform as well in the past as they should have done. I hope people are learning lessons.
And people talk about a cover-up. Do you think there was, or it wasn't as organised as that?
Well, I think it's just impossible to say. I think it's impossible to say, and I'm sure this is one of the things that the major public inquiry that we're embarking upon is going to be looking at, whether there was a cover-up, whether there was anything organised about a process of concealment. I've simply no idea, and at the moment no one else does either.
Peter Wanless again.
Of the 60,000 calls and contacts which the NSPCC helpline had last year, 1% turned out not to be accurate.
1%?
So people don't lightly enter into making allegations. They want to be listened to, they want to be supported. Now that does need to be balanced, absolutely, against the rights of someone who is having allegations made against them. But we are moving, I think, forward to a society now and in our public services where we understand that it's perfectly possible for people in authority, as well as people in everyday life, to exercise inappropriate power over children.
I've spoken to David over a couple of months now, got to know him a bit and met his wife and some of his children. He's told all of his family about his past life. It has no doubt caused pain and a few questions to be asked. So what is the upside of going public?
I just hope that, if nothing else, it'll set the record straight that, there were some terrible things going on. And I think the problem was that, what I experienced in the mid-70s then continued. It didn't stop. There were other trials, there were other scandals, but it just continued. And if most of them are dead, then at the very least, let's set the historical record straight. And I think, politicians in all parties need to recognise that if it's an open sore, it's never going to heal. The country will never come to terms with this. Politics needs to deal with this, and they need to recognise that some terrible things have happened. And, we hear stories of cover-ups and all the rest. It all has to stop. The truth has to come out. The truth will set people free, ultimately.
David isn't going to stop searching for evidence, and there are more leads to follow. Perhaps the police will find that needle in the haystack, or maybe we will. We have tried to lay out how we've gone about covering a story like David's. David, in many ways, is credible. Back at the start, I spoke to the police officer who questioned him. I detected genuine concern about him in his voice. The government's inquiry into child sex abuse will be hearing scores of stories similar to David's, and he's willing to give his evidence too. But even an exhaustive and critical inquiry, with a will to dig out the truth, uncover the facts, find that elusive evidence, have a huge task on their hands. Historical child sex abuse is not going away. Victims and those who witness these terrible crimes won't be ignored. They will be listened to and heard, but may not find the answers.
Becky Milligan, and if you missed any of her reports from earlier this week, you can listen to them on the World at One website, and that's also where you can find information about support groups which can offer help if you've been affected by any of the issues raised.